Millionaire sent his spoiled son to work collecting grapes. When he went to visit him, he almost fainted. Alexander Rothschild III stretched languidly on his custom-made Italian leather couch, his designer sunglasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, casting a golden glow over the minimalist decor that probably cost more than most people's yearly salaries. At 27, Alexander had never known a day of want in his life. As the only son of billionaire business tycoon Jonathan Rothschild, he had been born with a platinum spoon in his mouth and raised in a world where every whim was instantly gratified. His days were a blur of exclusive parties, exotic vacations, and impulsive purchases that would make even the most extravagant spender blush. "Alexa, play my Chill Vibes playlist," he mumbled, reaching for the crystal tumbler of aged scotch on the sleek coffee table. As the mellow beats of some obscure indie band filled the room, Alexander closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. His reverie was interrupted by the sharp buzz of his phone. Groaning, he fumbled for it, squinting at the screen. It was his father's personal assistant, Greta. "Mr. Rothschild, your father requests your presence at the main office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. He says it's urgent." Alexander rolled his eyes. Everything was urgent with his father, probably another lecture about responsibility and legacy. He typed out a quick reply, "Tell the old man I'll be there, maybe." Tossing the phone aside, he stood up and wandered to the window, gazing out at the glittering cityscape below. From up here, the world seemed small, manageable, a playground built for his amusement. He had never questioned his place in it, never doubted that he deserved every luxury that had been handed to him. But lately, a strange restlessness had been gnawing at him. The parties seemed less exciting, the vacations less thrilling. Even his fleet of sports cars, each more expensive than the last, failed to ignite the spark of joy they once had. "Is this all there is?" he murmured to himself, his breath fogging the spotless glass. The next morning, Alexander stumbled into his father's office 15 minutes late, nursing a hangover and wearing sunglasses indoors. Jonathan Rothschild, a distinguished man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, looked up from his desk with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Nice of you to join us, Alexander," Jonathan said, his voice clipped. "Please have a seat." Alexander flopped into one of the plush chairs facing his father's imposing mahogany desk. "What's the big emergency, Dad? Did one of your yachts spring a leak?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Son, we need to talk about your future." "Oh, not this again," Alexander groaned. "I told you I'm not interested in joining the family business. I'm doing just fine on my own." "Are you?" Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes boring into his son's. "Because from where I'm sitting, all I see is a young man wasting his potential, squandering his opportunities and sleepwalking through life." Alexander bristled. "I'm living my best life, Dad. Just because it doesn't fit into your narrow definition of success." "Enough." Jonathan's hand came down hard on the desk, making Alexander jump. "This isn't about success, Alexander. It's about purpose, about growth, about becoming a man worthy of the name Rothschild." For a moment, father and son stared at each other in tense silence. Then Jonathan's expression softened. "I love you, son. And that's why I can't stand by and watch you throw your life away anymore. I've made a decision." Alexander's stomach dropped. He didn't like the sound of this. "What kind of decision?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "I'm sending you to work on our family's vineyard in Napa Valley, for 6 months minimum." The words hit Alexander like a bucket of ice water. "You're... what? You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life," Jonathan replied calmly. "You'll work alongside our vineyard manager, learn every aspect of the business from the ground up. No special treatment, no luxuries. Just honest work and a chance to discover who you really are." Alexander leapt to his feet, his hangover forgotten in a surge of panic and anger. "This is insane. You can't just ship me off like some problem child. I have a life here, friends, commitments. All of which will still be here in 6 months, Jonathan cut in. "This isn't a punishment, Alexander, it's an opportunity. A chance to step outside the bubble you've been living in and see the world, and yourself, from a different perspective." Alexander paced the office, running his hands through his perfectly coiffed hair. "And if I refuse," Jonathan's expression hardened, "then I'll have no choice but to cut you off. Completely. No more allowance, no more credit cards, no more penthouse. You'll be on your own, with nothing but your wits and whatever skills you've managed to acquire in between parties." The ultimatum hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Alexander's mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything. But as he looked into his father's eyes, he realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escape. Jonathan Rothschild had made up his mind, and once he did that, not even God himself could change it. "When do I leave?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning," Jonathan replied. "I suggest you start packing. And Alexander?" He waited until his son met his gaze. "I truly believe this will be good for you. Who knows? You might even thank me one day." As Alexander trudged out of the office, his world spinning, he couldn't imagine ever thanking his father for this. Little did he know that the journey he was about to embark on would change his life in ways he could never have predicted. The small propeller plane touched down on the bumpy airstrip with a jolt that sent Alexander's stomach lurching. He peered out the window at the rolling hills covered in neat rows of grapevines, stretching as far as the eye could see. This was to be his home for the next 6 months, a far cry from the gleaming skyscrapers and bustling streets of Manhattan. As he disembarked, the warm California sun beat down on him, and he immediately regretted his choice of attire. His designer suit and Italian leather shoes, perfect for a high-powered business meeting or a swanky rooftop party, felt ridiculous in this rustic setting. A weathered pickup truck idled nearby, and beside it stood a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a Western movie. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands, he regarded Alexander with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. "You must be the boss's son," the man drawled, extending a hand. "Name's Tom. I manage this here vineyard." Alexander hesitated before shaking Tom's hand, acutely aware of the contrast between his own soft, manicured fingers and Tom's work-hardened grip. "Alexander Rothschild," he replied, trying to inject some confidence into his voice. "But, you can call me Alex." Tom nodded, his eyes twinkling with barely suppressed mirth. "Well, Alex, welcome to Rothschild Vineyards. Hope you're ready for some hard work, 'cause we start bright and early tomorrow morning." As they bounced along the dusty road in Tom's truck, Alexander's head spun with the whirlwind of changes. Just yesterday he had been sipping champagne in his penthouse, and now here he was, surrounded by nature and the pungent smell of fertilizer. The employee quarters turned out to be a modest cabin on the edge of the vineyard. It was clean and functional, but a far cry from the luxury Alexander was accustomed to. A small bedroom, a kitchenette, and a tiny bathroom were all he had to work with. "Dinner's at 7 in the main house," Tom informed him. "Don't be late. Oh, and you might want to change into something more practical." With that, he left Alexander alone to unpack and contemplate his new reality. As he hung up his designer clothes in the small closet, Alexander felt a wave of despair wash over him. What was he doing here? He didn't know the first thing about growing grapes or making wine. He was going to be a laughingstock, a city boy playing at being a farmer. But beneath the fear and self-doubt, there was a tiny spark of something else. Curiosity, perhaps? Or the faintest glimmer of excitement at the prospect of doing something completely outside his comfort zone. Dinner that night was a boisterous affair. The long table in the main house was crowded with vineyard workers, all talking and laughing as they passed around hearty dishes of home-cooked food. Alexander, dressed in the only casual clothes he owned, which still looked comically out of place, sat quietly, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar faces and the rapid-fire conversations in a mix of English and Spanish. Next to him sat an elderly man with kind eyes and a scraggly white beard. He introduced himself as Eduardo, one of the vineyard's longest-serving employees. "First time away from the big city, eh?" he asked Alexander with a gentle smile. Alexander nodded, grateful for the friendly overture. "Is it that obvious?" Eduardo chuckled. "Let's just say you stick out like a sore thumb, my young friend. But don't worry, we'll make a proper vintner out of you yet." As the evening wore on, Alexander found himself relaxing slightly. The food was simple but delicious, and the warmth and camaraderie around the table were infectious. He even managed to crack a smile at some of the good-natured teasing thrown his way. That night, lying on the slightly lumpy mattress in his cabin, Alexander stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. The sounds of nature, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, were so different from the constant hum of the city. It was unsettling, yet oddly peaceful. As he drifted off to sleep, his last conscious thought was a mix of trepidation and a strange, unexpected sense of anticipation for what the coming days might bring. The next morning arrived far too early for Alexander's liking. The insistent crowing of a rooster jolted him awake, and he groaned as he fumbled for his phone to check the time. 30 a.m. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen this hour of the morning from the other side. Stumbling out of bed, he splashed some cold water on his face and peered at his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his chin. He looked a far cry from his usual polished self. Outside, the vineyard was already bustling with activity. Workers moved efficiently between the rows of vines, their practiced hands quickly and deftly pruning, tying and tending to the precious grapes. Tom appeared at his side, looking annoyingly chipper for such an ungodly hour. "Morning, sunshine," he said with a grin. "Ready to get your hands dirty?" The next few hours were a blur of activity. Alexander struggled to keep up, as Tom led him through a crash course in basic vineyard maintenance. His soft hands quickly became sore and blistered as he awkwardly wielded pruning shears and tied vines to trellises. By mid-morning, Alexander was exhausted, sweaty, and thoroughly demoralized. His back ached, his hands stung, and he had managed to thoroughly entangle himself in a particularly stubborn grapevine. As he struggled to free himself, muttering curses under his breath, he heard a warm chuckle behind him. It was Eduardo, the older man from dinner the night before. "Having some trouble there, young man?" Eduardo asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Alexander sighed, admitting defeat. "I'm hopeless at this," he confessed. "I don't know what my father was thinking sending me here. I'm just going to mess everything up." Eduardo regarded him thoughtfully for a moment, then began to gently disentangle Alexander from the vine. "You know," he said conversationally, "these vines are a lot like people. They need care, patience, and understanding to thrive. And just like people, they can surprise you with their resilience and their ability to grow in unexpected ways." As Eduardo worked, he began to explain the intricacies of caring for the vines, how to read the leaves for signs of disease or nutrient deficiency, how to prune to encourage the best grape production, how each decision made in the vineyard would ultimately affect the quality of the wine. To his surprise, Alexander found himself fascinated. There was a complexity to the process that he had never considered before, a delicate balance of science and artistry that appealed to his analytical mind. "The trick," Eduardo said as he finished freeing Alexander, "is to work with nature, not against it, to understand that everything here is connected, and that even the smallest action can have far-reaching consequences." Alexander nodded slowly, a new respect dawning in his eyes. "I never realized... I always thought wine just kind of... happened." Eduardo laughed, a rich, warm sound that seemed to resonate through the vineyard. "Oh, my boy, there is so much for you to learn. But don't worry, we'll teach you. If you're willing to listen, that is." As they walked back towards the main house for lunch, Alexander felt a shift in his perspective. The vineyard, which had seemed like an alien and hostile place just hours ago, now felt alive with possibility. He had a long way to go, but for the first time since arriving, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his place here. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Alexander woke each morning with the sun, his body gradually adjusting to the early hours and physical labor. He worked alongside the other vineyard employees, learning the names of tools he had never known existed, and developing a newfound appreciation for the complexity of winemaking. There were still moments of frustration and self-doubt. More than once, Alexander found himself on the verge of calling his father and begging to be allowed to return to the city, but each time something held him back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing sense that he was, despite all odds, starting to enjoy the challenge. As the weeks passed, Alexander's hands grew calloused, His skin tanned and his designer clothes gave way to practical workwear. He found himself looking forward to the communal dinners, where he was gradually being accepted as part of the vineyard family. He listened eagerly to the stories shared around the table, tales of harvests past and the rich history of the land, and always there was Eduardo, ready with a word of encouragement or a bit of wisdom, just when Alexander needed it most. The old man seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear whenever Alexander was struggling, offering not just practical advice, but also insights that went far beyond the technicalities of grape growing. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Eduardo's small house watching the sun set over the vineyard, Alexander found himself opening up about his life in the city, his relationship with his father, and the emptiness he had been feeling before coming to the vineyard. I never felt like I was enough, you know," he confessed, surprised by his own candor. "No matter what I did, it was never quite right, so I just stopped trying." Eduardo nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of the wine they were sharing, a vintage from the very vines they had been tending. "You know, Alexander, there's an old saying among vintners, the vine that is forced to bear too early will produce sour grapes." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Eduardo replied with a gentle smile, "that growth takes time. You can't rush it, can't force it. Each vine, each person, has their own rhythm, their own time to bloom. Your father, in his own way, is trying to give you the space to find yours." As the words sank in, Alexander felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he began to see his exile to the vineyard not as a punishment, but as an opportunity, and chance to discover who he truly was, away from the expectations and pressures of his old life. With this new perspective, Alexander threw himself into the work with renewed vigor. He pestered Tom and Eduardo with endless questions, eager to understand every aspect of the winemaking process. He volunteered for the most challenging tasks, pushing himself to learn and grow. As summer turned to fall, the vineyard buzzed with the excitement of the approaching harvest. Alexander found himself caught up in the anticipation, realizing with some surprise that he was genuinely looking forward to seeing the fruits of his labor. The day of the harvest dawned clear and crisp. Alexander was up before the rooster, unable to contain his excitement. As he joined the other workers in the fields, there was a palpable sense of joy and camaraderie in the air. For hours they worked tirelessly, carefully selecting and cutting the ripe clusters of grapes. Alexander's hands moved with a confidence that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. As he worked, he found himself reflecting on how much he had changed since arriving at the vineyard. It wasn't just the physical changes, though those were significant. His once soft hands were now calloused and strong, his designer tan replaced by the genuine bronze of someone who worked outdoors. But the real transformation was deeper. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt a sense of purpose, of belonging. He understood the satisfaction of a hard day's work, the joy of creating something with his own hands. The petty concerns that had once consumed him, the latest fashion trends, the hottest clubs, the most expensive cars, seemed trivial now. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, Tom called for everyone's attention. "Great work today, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying across the fields. "And now, as is tradition, we celebrate." What followed was a feast unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced. Tables groaned under the weight of home-cooked dishes, and wine flowed freely. There was music and laughter, and even dancing as the night wore on. In the midst of the celebration, Alexander found a quiet moment with Eduardo. The old man's eyes twinkled as he regarded his young protege. "So, Alexander," Eduardo said, handing him a glass of their finest vintage, "what do you think of the vintner's life now?" Alexander took a sip of the wine, savoring the complex flavors that he could now appreciate in a way he never could before. "It's incredible," he said honestly. "I never imagined I could feel this fulfilled." Eduardo nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "You've come a long way, my boy. But tell me, what will you do when your 6 months are up? Will you return to your old life in the city?" The question caught Alexander off guard. In the whirlwind of activity and learning, he had almost forgotten that his time at the vineyard was meant to be temporary. The thought of leaving, of going back to his old life, filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. I don't know, he admitted. I'm not sure I can go back to who I was before. Nor should you, Eduardo said gently. The question is not whether you will go back, but how you will move forward. Remember, just as each season brings changes to the vineyard, so too must we be willing to grow and adapt. As the celebration continued around them, Alexander fell into deep thought. He knew that a decision lay ahead of him, one that would shape the course of his future. But for now, he allowed himself to be present in the moment, to feel the joy of the harvest and the warmth of the community he had become a part of. Little did he know that the biggest challenge and the most important decision of his life still lay ahead. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of wood smoke as Alexander made his way up the winding driveway of the Rothschild estate. 6 months had passed since he'd last set foot on these manicured grounds, but it felt like a lifetime ago. He paused at the top of the drive, taking in the imposing facade of his childhood home. The mansion, with its soaring columns and expansive windows, had once represented everything he thought he wanted in life. Now it felt strangely foreign, like a relic from another era. Taking a deep breath, Alexander straightened his shoulders and walked to the front door. Before he could reach for the bell, the door swung open, revealing his father's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy. "Master Alexander," she exclaimed, her eyes widening in surprise. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." Alexander gave her a warm smile, something that would have been rare 6 months ago. "I caught an earlier flight, Mrs. A. Is my father home?" She nodded, ushering him inside. "He's in his study. Shall I announce you?" "No need," Alexander replied, already heading towards the familiar oak-paneled door at the end of the hall. "I'd like to surprise him." As he approached his father's study, Alexander felt a mix of emotions swirling within him. Nervousness, excitement, and a strange sense of calm all vied for dominance. He knocked softly on the door. "Come in," came his father's distracted voice. Alexander pushed open the door to find Jonathan Rothschild hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing computer screens. For a moment, his father didn't look up, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Dad," Alexander said softly. Jonathan's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other, taking in the changes that 6 months had wrought. Finally, Jonathan stood, a tentative smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Alexander," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're early." Alexander nodded, suddenly feeling like a little boy again under his father's scrutiny. "I hope that's okay. I was eager to get back." Jonathan came around the desk, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "You look different," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. And indeed, Alexander did look different. Gone was the pampered playboy with the designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair. In his place stood a young man with sun-bronzed skin, calloused hands, and a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from within. "I feel different," Alexander admitted. "Dad, I want to thank you for sending me to the vineyard. It changed everything." Jonathan's eyes misted over, and in a move that surprised them both, he pulled his son into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, son," he whispered, "so very proud." As they pulled apart, both men a little misty-eyed, Jonathan gestured for Alexander to sit. "Tell me everything," he said eagerly. "How was it? What did you learn?" And so Alexander began to talk. He told his father about the early mornings and long days of physical labor. He described the intricacies of vine care and the science behind fermentation. He spoke of the community he had found among the workers, the sense of purpose that had filled a void he hadn't even known existed. As he talked, Jonathan listened intently, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the transformation he was witnessing in his son. The petulant boy he had sent away 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a thoughtful, passionate young man. "And Eduardo," Alexander was saying, his eyes shining with admiration. "He taught me so much, Dad. Not just about wine, but about life, about finding balance and purpose." Jonathan nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "Eduardo has been with our family for generations. I had a feeling he might have an impact on you." Alexander leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Dad, I want to talk to you about the future, about my role in the company." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, curiosity evident in his expression. "Oh? And what are your thoughts on that?" Taking a deep breath, Alexander laid out the plan that had been forming in his mind over the past few months. He spoke of modernizing the vineyard's operations while respecting traditional methods, of expanding their sustainability initiatives, of creating educational programs to train the next generation of vintners. As he talked, Jonathan's expression shifted from surprise to interest to outright enthusiasm. When Alexander finally finished, slightly out of breath and flushed with excitement, his father leaned back in his chair, a broad smile on his face. "Well, well," Jonathan said, a note of pride in his voice. "It seems the prodigal son has not only returned, but has brought with him a vision for the future." Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him. "So, you like the ideas?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "I do. They're ambitious, forward-thinking, and show a real understanding of both the business and the craft. But more importantly," he added, fixing Alexander with a piercing gaze, "they show me that you've found something you're truly passionate about." A lump formed in Alexander's throat. All his life he had sought his father's approval, often in all the wrong ways. To hear it now, freely given and genuinely meant, was almost overwhelming. "There's just one thing," Jonathan continued, his tone turning serious. "These plans of yours, they'll require a significant investment of time and resources. Are you prepared for that level of commitment, to really dig in and see this through?" Alexander didn't hesitate. "I am, Dad. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want to do, and I'm ready to work hard to make it happen." Jonathan stood, extending his hand to his son. "Then welcome to Rothschild Vineyards, Alexander. I think it's time we had a proper tour of the corporate offices, don't you?" As they left the study together, a new understanding between them, Alexander felt a surge of excitement for what lay ahead. The journey that had begun as a punishment had led him to discover his true calling. Now, with his father's support and his own newfound determination, he was ready to embark on the next chapter of his life. Little did he know that the challenges and rewards of merging his new passion with the realities of the business world were only just beginning. The sleek, modern offices of Rothschild Enterprises stood in stark contrast to the rustic charm of the vineyard where Alexander had spent the past 6 months. As he followed his father through the bustling corridors, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. This was a world he had actively avoided for years, dismissing it as boring and soulless. Now he was willingly stepping into it, armed with ideas and a determination to make a difference. Jonathan led him into a large conference room where a group of executives was already gathered. The room fell silent as they entered, all eyes turning to Alexander with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan announced, his voice carrying a note of pride that Alexander had rarely heard before, "I'd like to reintroduce you to my son, Alexander. He's joining us today to present some exciting new initiatives for our vineyard division." Alexander stepped forward, acutely aware of the scrutiny he was under. These people had known him as the irresponsible party boy, the black sheep of the Rothschild family. Now he had to prove to them, and to himself, that he had changed. Taking a deep breath, he launched into his presentation. He spoke passionately about sustainable farming practices, about leveraging technology to improve wine quality while honoring traditional methods. He outlined plans for an apprenticeship program to train young vintners, emphasizing the importance of preserving and passing on the craft. As he talked, Alexander could see the expressions around the table changing. Skepticism gave way to interest, and in some cases, outright enthusiasm. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in a flurry of questions and comments. For the next hour, Alexander found himself engaged in the kind of intellectual discourse he had always assumed would be mind-numbingly dull. To his surprise, he was energized by it. He drew on the practical knowledge he had gained at the vineyard, combining it with the business acumen he had absorbed almost by osmosis, growing up in the Rothschild household. As the meeting wound down, Jonathan stood to address the group. "I think we can all agree that Alexander has presented us with some compelling ideas," he said, beaming with pride. "I propose we move forward with a pilot program to implement these initiatives at our Napa Valley vineyard." The motion was met with unanimous approval. As the executives filed out of the room, Many stopped to shake Alexander's hand, offering congratulations and expressing excitement about the new direction. When they were alone, Jonathan turned to his son. "Well done, Alexander. Very well done indeed." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest at his father's praise. "Thanks, Dad. I'm really excited about this." Jonathan clapped him on the shoulder. "As you should be, but remember, this is just the beginning. Turning these ideas into reality will be a challenge. Are you ready for that?" Alexander nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "More than ready. I want to make a real difference, Dad. Not just for our business, but for the whole industry." Over the next few months, Alexander threw himself into his work with a passion that surprised everyone, including himself. He split his time between the corporate offices and the vineyard, determined to stay connected to both worlds. At the vineyard, he worked closely with Tom and the other employees to implement new sustainable farming practices. There were setbacks and frustrations, of course. Some of the older workers were resistant to change, and not every new idea panned out as well in practice as it had in theory. But Alexander persevered, drawing on the patience and resilience he had learned during his time working the fields. He listened to concerns, adjusted his plans when necessary, and slowly but surely began to win over even the most skeptical members of the team. Back in the city, he dove into the business side of things with equal fervor. He pored over financial reports, studied market trends, and worked late into the night, developing strategies to position Rothschild vineyards at the forefront of the industry. It wasn't always easy. There were times when Alexander felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was trying to accomplish. In those moments, he would think back to his conversations with Eduardo, drawing strength from the old man's wisdom. One particularly challenging day, after a difficult meeting with investors who were skeptical about the costs associated with the new sustainability initiatives, Alexander found himself sitting in his office, head in his hands. A soft knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. He looked up to see his father standing in the doorway, a concerned expression on his face. "Tough day?" Jonathan asked, stepping into the office. Alexander nodded wearily. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but sometimes it feels like I'm trying to move a mountain with a teaspoon." Jonathan chuckled, taking a seat across from his son. "Welcome to the world of business, son. But let me tell you something." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "In all my years running this company, I've never seen anyone work as hard or with as much passion as you have these past few months. You're making a real difference, Alexander. Don't lose sight of that." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." Jonathan smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I have something for you. It arrived this morning." Curious, Alexander took the envelope. It was addressed to him, the return address indicating it had come from the vineyard. He opened it to find a letter written in Eduardo's distinctive scrawl. As he read, a smile spread across his face. Eduardo wrote of the changes happening at the vineyard, of the excitement among the workers about the new initiatives. But more than that, he wrote of his pride in Alexander, of how the young man he had mentored was now leading the way towards a brighter future for the industry they both loved. Included with the letter was a photograph. It showed the vineyard workers gathered around a newly installed solar panel array, all smiling and giving thumbs up. In the foreground, propped against the base of the array, was a bottle of wine with a special label, Rothschild Renewal, First Harvest. Alexander felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was tangible proof that his efforts were making a real, positive impact. He looked up at his father, who was watching him with a knowing smile. "Sometimes," Jonathan said gently, "when you're in the thick of things, it's hard to see the progress you're making. But trust me, son, you're doing something special here." Alexander nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and determination. He pinned the photo to his bulletin board, a constant reminder of why he was working so hard. As his father left the office, Alexander turned back to his computer, ready to dive back into work. He had a mountain to move, after all, and even if he had to do it with a teaspoon, he was determined to see it through. The next few months flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander's days were a blur of meetings, site visits, and late nights poring over reports and projections. But despite the long hours and constant challenges, he felt more alive than he ever had before. The pilot program at the Napa vineyard was showing promising results. The new sustainable practices were not only reducing their environmental impact, but also improving the quality of the grapes. Word was spreading in the industry, and other vineyards were starting to take notice. Alexander's apprenticeship program was also taking off. Young, enthusiastic wine lovers from around the world were applying for the chance to learn the art of winemaking from some of the best in the business. Watching these apprentices discover their passion for viticulture reminded Alexander of his own journey, and he often found himself sharing the wisdom Eduardo had imparted to him. As autumn approached once again, bringing with it the excitement of another harvest, Alexander received news that filled him with both pride and nervousness. The prestigious International Wine Challenge had selected Rothschild Vineyard's new sustainable vintage as a finalist for their Innovation Award. This recognition was a validation of everything Alexander had been working towards. It was an opportunity to showcase their new methods on a global stage and potentially influence the entire industry. But it also meant increased scrutiny and pressure to deliver on the promises they'd made. The day before he was due to fly to London for the awards ceremony, Alexander decided to pay a visit to the vineyard. As he walked among the vines, now heavy with ripe grapes ready for harvest, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He found Tom supervising a group of workers and apprentices who were carefully checking the grapes for optimal ripeness. "Well, if it isn't the big shot CEO," Tom called out with a grin. "Shouldn't you be off polishing your acceptance speech?" Alexander laughed, clasping Tom's hand warmly. "Not a CEO yet, and definitely not counting any chickens. How are things looking here?" Tom's expression turned serious. "It's going to be a good harvest, Alex. Maybe our best yet. These new methods of yours, they're really paying off." A surge of pride went through Alexander. "It's not just my methods, Tom. It's everyone here, putting in the hard work to make it happen." As they walked through the vineyard, discussing the upcoming harvest, Alexander spotted a familiar figure sitting under the old oak tree, where they often used to talk. His heart leapt as he recognized Eduardo. Excusing himself from Tom, Alexander made his way over to the old man. Eduardo looked up as he approached, a warm smile spreading across his weathered face. "Alexander, my boy," Eduardo said, his voice filled with affection. "I was hoping you'd stop by before your big trip." Alexander sat down next to his mentor, feeling the same sense of calm and clarity that Eduardo had always inspired in him. "I couldn't leave without seeing you, Eduardo. I wanted to thank you for everything." Eduardo waved his hand dismissively. "You did all the hard work yourself, Alexander. I just pointed you in the right direction." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, looking out over the vineyard. Finally, Eduardo spoke again, his voice soft and thoughtful. "You know, when you first came here, I saw a young man lost in the world, unsure of his place in it. Now look at you. You found your purpose, your passion. You're not just running a business, you're changing lives." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Eduardo. Your guidance, your wisdom. It changed everything for me." Eduardo turned to him, his eyes twinkling. "Do you remember what I told you about the vines? How they need care and patience to thrive?" Alexander nodded, smiling at the memory. "Well," Eduardo continued, "you've become quite the vintner, Alexander. Not just of grapes, but of people. You're nurturing the land, the business, and the people who work here. That's a rare and precious skill." Tears pricked at Alexander's eyes. "I just want to make a difference," he said softly. Eduardo placed a gnarled hand on Alexander's shoulder. "My boy, you already have. Win or lose at that fancy awards ceremony, what you've done here is the real victory. Never forget that." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, Alexander and Eduardo sat together, talking about the past, the present, and the bright future that lay ahead. In that moment, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here, and excitement for where it might lead next. The next day, as he boarded the plane to London, Alexander carried with him not just the hopes of his family and the vineyard workers, but also the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're on the right path. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, armed with the lessons he'd learned among the vines and the unwavering support of those who believed in him. Little did he know that the biggest test of his newfound strength and wisdom was yet to come. The opulent ballroom of the London Hilton buzzed with excitement as the cream of the international wine industry gathered for the Innovation Awards. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits, the air filled with the gentle clink of champagne flutes and the murmur of dozens of languages. Alexander tugged at his bow tie, feeling slightly out of place despite his tailored tuxedo. He'd grown more comfortable in work boots and jeans over the past year, and the glitz and glamour of this event seemed a world away from the earthy reality of the vineyard. "Nervous?" his father asked, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. Alexander accepted one with a grateful smile. "A little," he admitted. "It's not just about winning, you know. It's about what this could mean for sustainable winemaking as a whole." Jonathan nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "You've come a long way, son. Whatever happens tonight, remember that." As they mingled with the other attendees, Alexander found himself drawn into conversations about Rothschild Vineyard's innovative practices. He spoke passionately about their sustainability initiatives, the apprenticeship program, and their plans for the future. "Mr. Rothschild?" a voice interrupted. Alexander turned to see a tall, elegant woman with striking green eyes. "Sophia Valdez," she introduced herself, extending a manicured hand. "I'm with Greenvine Innovations. I've been following your work with great interest." Alexander shook her hand, intrigued. He'd heard of Greenvine. They were making waves in the industry with their eco-friendly viticulture technologies. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Valdez. I'm a fan of what Greenvine is doing." Sophia's eyes lit up. "Perhaps we could find some time to talk later? I have a proposition that I think might interest you." Before Alexander could respond, the announcement came for everyone to take their seats for the award ceremony. He promised Sophia they'd connect later and made his way to the Rothschild table, his mind buzzing with curiosity about her mysterious proposition. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of speeches and polite applause. Finally, the moment arrived for the Innovation Award. Alexander held his breath as the presenter opened the envelope. "And the winner is Rothschild Vineyards for their Sustainable Viticulture Initiative." The room erupted in applause as Alexander, in a daze, made his way to the stage. As he accepted the award, he looked out over the sea of faces and felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a validation of everything he and his team had worked so hard to achieve. In his acceptance speech, Alexander spoke from the heart about the importance of sustainability in winemaking, about honoring tradition while embracing innovation, and about the incredible team at Rothschild Vineyards who had made it all possible. As he concluded to enthusiastic applause, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. The rest of the evening was a whirlwind of congratulations and photo opportunities. It was nearly midnight when Alexander finally found a moment to slip away to the terrace for some fresh air. He was gazing out over the twinkling lights of London, the weight of the award heavy in his hands, when he heard footsteps behind him. "Congratulations, Mr. Rothschild," Sophia Valdez said, joining him at the railing. "A well-deserved win." Alexander turned to her with a smile. "Thank you, and please call me Alexander." Sophia nodded, her green eyes intense in the moonlight. "Alexander, then. I hope you don't mind me seeking you out like this, but I wanted to discuss that proposition I mentioned earlier." Intrigued, Alexander gestured for her to continue. "Greenvine has been developing some revolutionary technology," Sophia explained, her voice low and excited. "Automated harvesting systems, AI-driven fermentation control, even drones for precision viticulture. We're on the cusp of changing the entire industry." Alexander listened, fascinated. He'd heard whispers of such technologies, but nothing concrete until now. "We're looking for partners," Sophia continued. "Forward-thinking vineyards willing to be early adopters. With your reputation for innovation and sustainability, Rothschild Vineyards would be the perfect flagship for our rollout." Alexander's mind raced with the possibilities. This kind of technology could revolutionize their operations, potentially increasing yield and quality, while further reducing their environmental impact. It was an exciting prospect. But as Sophia continued to outline the proposal, a small voice of caution whispered in the back of Alexander's mind. He thought of the vineyard workers, of the apprentices learning the craft of traditional winemaking. How would this level of automation affect them? "It's an intriguing offer," Alexander said carefully, but I'd need to discuss it with my team and see how it aligns with our current methods and values. Sophia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course, but I urge you to consider carefully, Alexander. This is the future of winemaking. You don't want to be left behind. As Alexander made his way back to his hotel room that night, his head spun with conflicting thoughts. The award in his hand represented everything he'd achieved by embracing sustainable traditional methods. But Sophia's words echoed in his mind. Was he risking the vineyard's future by not fully embracing cutting-edge technology? He fell into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with images of robot harvesters roaming through endless rows of grapes, and Eduardo's disappointed face watching from the sidelines. The next morning, Alexander woke early, jet-lagged and still unsettled from his conversation with Sophia. He opened his laptop, intending to draft an email to his father about the green vine proposal, but found himself instead looking at photos from the vineyard. Images of smiling workers, proud apprentices, and thriving vines filled his screen. He zoomed in on one photo in particular, Eduardo, standing among the vines, his weathered hand gently cradling a bunch of grapes, his face etched with the wisdom of years spent nurturing the land. Suddenly, Alexander knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Eduardo," he said when the old man answered, "I need your advice." Over the next hour, Alexander poured out everything: the award, Sophia's proposal, his fears and doubts. Eduardo listened patiently, occasionally asking a clarifying question, but mostly letting Alexander talk. When Alexander finally fell silent, Eduardo was quiet for a long moment. Then, in his gentle, gravelly voice, he began to speak. "Alexander, my boy, do you remember what I told you about working with nature, not against it?" "Of course," Alexander replied. "Technology is a tool just like our pruning shears or our barrels. It can help us, but it should never replace the human touch, the connection to the land." Eduardo paused, and Alexander could almost see the thoughtful expression on his face. "Innovation is good, but not at the cost of our soul." As Eduardo continued to share his thoughts, Alexander felt the fog of doubt lifting. By the time they said goodbye, he knew exactly what he needed to do. He spent the rest of the morning drafting a detailed email to his father and the board, outlining a plan that would incorporate some of Greenvine's technologies, the ones that aligned with their values and could enhance their sustainable practices, while maintaining their commitment to traditional craftsmanship and their workforce. As he hit send, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was charting a course that honored both innovation and tradition, technology and human expertise. It wouldn't be easy, but he was confident it was the right path. Later that day, as he boarded his flight back home, Alexander's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his father. "Proud of you, son. You're making the right choice. Let's talk more when you're back." Alexander smiled, settling back into his seat. He closed his eyes, picturing the vineyard, his vineyard, and all the people who made it special. There would be challenges ahead, he knew, but with the lessons he'd learned and the support of his team, he was ready to face them. As the plane took off, carrying him back to the land and the work he loved, Alexander felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey that had begun as a punishment had led him to discover not just a career, but a calling. And he was just getting started. The early morning mist hung low over the vineyard as Alexander made his way through the rows of vines. It had been a year since the Innovation Awards, a year of hard work, tough decisions, and exciting progress. Today was the day they would unveil the results of their carefully balanced approach to innovation and tradition. As he walked, Alexander reflected on the challenges they'd faced. Integrating some of Greenvine's technologies while maintaining their commitment to traditional methods and their workforce hadn't been easy. There had been resistance from some of the older workers, skepticism from industry traditionalists, and moments when Alexander himself had doubted whether they were on the right path. But they had persevered. They had listened to concerns, adapted their plans, and worked tirelessly to create a model that respected both innovation and tradition. Today, they would be hosting a group of industry leaders, journalists, and even some of their harshest critics to showcase what they had achieved. Alexander paused at the edge of a section where their new precision viticulture drones were at work. The quiet hum of the machines was barely audible as they moved methodically over the vines, using advanced sensors to collect data on soil moisture, grape ripeness, and potential disease pressures. This information would help them make more precise decisions about irrigation, harvesting, and pest management, reducing water usage and the need for chemical interventions. Nearby, a group of apprentices was gathered around Eduardo, who was demonstrating the art of hand pruning. The juxtaposition made Alexander smile. This was exactly what they had been striving for, a harmony between cutting-edge technology and time-honored craftsmanship. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" a familiar voice said behind him. Alexander turned to see his father approaching, a look of pride on his face. "It really is, Dad," Alexander replied, his voice filled with emotion. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how far we've come." Jonathan clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've done an incredible job, Alexander. You've taken the vision you had and turned it into reality, and you've done it in a way that stays true to who we are." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the vineyard came to life around them. Workers and machines moved in a well-choreographed dance, each playing their part in nurturing the precious grapes. "Are you ready for today?" Jonathan asked. Alexander took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. There's still a lot of skepticism out there about whether this hybrid approach can really work. Today's our chance to show them that it can." As the morning progressed, guests began to arrive. Alexander led tours through the vineyard, explaining their integrated approach. He showed how the data collected by their drones and sensors was used to support, not replace, the expertise of their vintners. He demonstrated how their automated sorting system worked in tandem with human quality control to ensure only the best grapes made it into their wines. The guests were particularly impressed by the apprenticeship program. Alexander beamed with pride as he introduced some of the young vintners in training, watching them confidently explain the traditional techniques they were learning alongside the cutting-edge technologies. As the tour group paused for a moment in the shade of the old oak tree, a familiar figure approached. It was Sofia Valdez from Greenvine, her expression a mix of curiosity and admiration. "I have to admit, Alexander," she said, "when you only partially accepted our proposal, I was skeptical. But seeing this," she gestured around her, "it's impressive. You've managed to embrace innovation without losing the heart of what makes winemaking special." Alexander smiled, feeling a sense of vindication. "Thank you, Sophia. It hasn't been easy, but we believe this balanced approach is the future of sustainable winemaking." As the day wore on, Alexander could sense the mood shifting. The initial skepticism of many guests was giving way to genuine interest and excitement. Even some of the staunchest traditionalists were nodding approvingly as they saw how technology was being used to enhance, not replace, traditional methods. The highlight of the day came when they gathered in the tasting room to sample the first vintage, produced under the new integrated system. As Alexander watched the expressions of delight and surprise on the faces of the industry experts, he felt a surge of pride and gratitude. One of the critics, a notoriously hard-to-please wine journalist, raised his glass. "To Rothschild Vineyards," he announced, "for showing us that the future of winemaking doesn't have to come at the expense of its past." As glasses clinked and congratulations were offered, Alexander felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Eduardo, his eyes twinkling. "Come with me," the old man said softly. "There's something I want to show you." Curious, Alexander followed Eduardo out of the tasting room and through the vineyard. They walked in silence until they reached a small, secluded plot that Alexander didn't recognize. Here, the vines looked different, older, gnarled, yet still vibrant with life. "Do you know what these are?" Eduardo asked, his voice filled with reverence. Alexander shook his head, intrigued. "These," Eduardo said, gently touching one of the twisted vines, "are some of the original Rothschild vines planted by your great-great-grandfather. They've survived droughts, frosts, and diseases that wiped out younger vines. And do you know why?" Alexander listened intently, sensing the importance of the moment. "Because they've put down deep roots," Eduardo continued. "They've adapted to this land, become a part of it. Just like you have, my boy." Emotion welled up in Alexander's chest as he understood the metaphor. Eduardo was right. He had put down roots here, grown in ways he never could have imagined when he first arrived at the vineyard. "I've been tending these vines in secret," Eduardo explained, "and this year, for the first time in decades, they produced grapes. Not many, but enough for a small special batch of wine." He reached into his weathered jacket and pulled out a bottle. The label was handwritten, "Rothschild Legacy, Alexander's Vintage." "This is my gift to you," Eduardo said, pressing the bottle into Alexander's hands, a reminder of where you came from and how far you've grown. Overcome with emotion, Alexander pulled the old man into a tight embrace. "Thank you, Eduardo," he whispered, "for everything." As they walked back to join the others, bottle in hand, Alexander felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun as a reluctant exile had led him to discover not just a career, but a calling. He had found his place in the world, bridging the gap between tradition and innovation, between the legacy of his family and the promise of the future. That evening, as the sun set over the vineyard, casting a golden glow over the rows of vines, Alexander gathered his family, Eduardo, and the core team from the vineyard. He opened the special bottle of Rothschild Legacy wine, pouring a small amount for each person. Raising his glass, Alexander looked around at the faces of those who had supported him, challenged him, and helped him grow. "Two roots," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "both the ones that anchor us and the ones that allow us to grow." As they sipped the wine, savoring its complex flavors that spoke of history and potential, Alexander felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more innovations to navigate, more traditions to honor, but he was ready for whatever the future might bring. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the warmth of shared purpose, Alexander Rothschild III, once the spoiled son of a millionaire, now a vintner, innovator, and leader, knew that he had finally found his true vintage. The vineyard stretched out before him, a testament to the power of transformation, the importance of balance, and the enduring strength of deep roots. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Alexander raised his glass one more time in a silent toast, to the journey, to the lessons learned, and to the endless possibilities that lay ahead. And so, as the crickets began their nightly chorus and the cool evening breeze carried the promise of tomorrow's adventures, the story of Alexander's transformation came to a close. But in many ways, it was just the beginning. For in the world of wine, as in life, each season brings new challenges, new opportunities, and the chance to create something truly extraordinary. As Alexander looked out over the vineyard that had become his home, his purpose and his legacy, he smiled. Whatever the future might hold, he was ready to face it. With deep roots, an open mind, and a heart full of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led him here.